So this is DevSecOps, an organizational primer. My name is Tim Anderson. I'm a senior technical industry specialist with AWS Security. And what we're going to focus on for this morning session is, one, looking at particular aspects for building a DevSecOps model in your organization, sort of a blueprint, key elements you can take away. And to feed that, also looking at things from a security practitioner's perspective, which will go in and feed the particular aspects of building the automation and the mechanisms to actually proliferate security throughout and really transition into a DevSecOps model. And ideally, what this will end up doing is allow you to pick out key characteristics within your own organizations and businesses to actually create a strategy to move, whether it's from just agile operations to DevSecOps, whether you're operating in a DevOps model already into DevSecOps. So, and especially when highly regulated industries, we're starting to find that DevOps is not really enough in order to make that transition. You have to really start inculcating security in the process. And so how we're going to get there is really focusing on sort of three different perspectives. One is building the business case for it, really understanding how you're actually going to craft DevSecOps as a business driver and making that case so you can have buy-in from leadership, because you are going to be using resources from other teams. And then from a foundational team aspect, looking at the Cloud Center of Excellence model really as a DevSecOps foundational team in order to drive initial patterns and success and practices that'll end up scaling as your organization finds success. And then finally, looking at how you're going to use automation and mechanisms like CI/CD to actually scale that security, to demonstrate assurance to the security org in order to get the proper buy-in and guardrails instantiated. So first off, when we talk about culture, in the context of this, because really DevSecOps, DevOps, a lot of the agile changeover has to do with really addressing cultural issues within an organization. The tools, the automation are sort of to help feed the quality and velocity of those aspects, but it's really a cultural issue first. And when we're talking about culture, we're talking about sort of the values and beliefs that govern the way people behave in an organization. And a lot of times we find that that is really communicated more through tribal knowledge, and is not necessarily documented or a driver for like a established cultural element of an organization. And what this ends up doing, especially in traditional organizations, is that you have compartmentalization with developers actually paid to build and change things, to innovate, to drive improvements to the business. And then you have operations, which are there to actually keep things from changing, to have consistency, a normal behavior, be able to monitor the health. They really want to drive a particular baseline. And then in between you have security, which are now focused on addressing things developers do, so security weaknesses are not brought in and proliferated into production by operations. And so you have all these competing forces that usually end up really floating to the top in the form of different challenges, different elements of like gating delivery to production, really stifling innovation on the business side. So you see sort of a common set of challenges that we hear. And even if you're operating in a DevOps mode, a lot of these challenges are still surfacing, especially if security is a siloed organization in that respect. So what that really means as far as cultural change, in order to get the right stepping stone into place, is building a business case where the stakeholders are really integrated and have consensus on what the path forward is and a strategy for using DevSecOps to address particular business and needs and objectives. And really, when we're talking and sort of defining DevSecOps, we're looking at it from both a cultural point of view that is then augmented by tooling and mechanisms in order to achieve it. And it's particularly tooling and mechanisms you hear a lot more in DevSecOps than just the pure cultural transition in DevOps, because honestly, the ability to hire enough security expertise is just not going to happen. And so you have to use tooling and mechanisms to really ingrain security in the pipeline process. Yes. Question? Sorry, can you repeat that?
What do you mean by production?
Oh, so the question is what do we mean by production mutability? Basically, you're wanting to craft production and into a encased environment that doesn't change, and then you're actually feeding changes to production through a build pipeline based off of that actual construction of, let's say, in an AWS example, a CloudFormation template, that actually that code, you're doing infrastructure code, then that changes, and then that drives a new provisioning in production versus you're going into production and you're doing changes and you're trying to manage these live changes. So on the Tenets side, which is really important when you're actually constructing a business case for DevSecOps, is understanding really what the scope is. Anytime you're trying to drive organizational change, cultural change, you want to really define where the scope is in order to really hone in and target your key objectives and then the tactics you want to go into in addressing those. And in this particular case with DevSecOps, you're trying to push security to the left as far as possible, as early in the ideation phase, in the commit phases of builds. You want to go and actually capture the testing and elements as early as possible to both demonstrate assurance but actually reduce risk as things go through the pipeline and into production. And in order to do that, you're going to put in a lot of controls. You're going to look at where to be proactive, and driving left actually creates a proactive nature, because then you're thinking whether it's custom linting tools or you're having code reviews, peer reviews on there, you're catching things as early as possible before they're going farther down the pipeline and consuming resources unnecessarily. And then you're also looking at ways of taking telemetry off of pipeline, logging, automation, that as you go through these tenets, you want to actually establish peer mechanisms so you have full visibility in the activities. You have logging and monitoring, and you have actually responsive measures to go back, provide that feedback loop, and actually iterate. Now, one of the key elements of this is really coming down to rapid and secure delivery of services while you're reducing risk and resource waste. So that's all really what it cycles down to, is looking at whether the mechanisms are going to build in order to do that. And of course, automation is going to be key in that aspect. So in the benefits, everyone preaches DevSecOps now. There's a lot of, from a buzzword perspective, it's very popular. But it's really understanding what we talked about when it comes to rapidly delivering secure services. And what you really want to do is you want to show enough assurance, especially to the security organizations and the business leaders at large, in order that you're reducing risk and waste, but you're actually being able to innovate at a higher pace. And in particular, you want to look at what concerns of the business am I trying to address. So DevSecOps is not a panacea for business issues and innovation issues, right? Neither is DevOps or anything else. You want to look at it as a means of particularly addressing what the needs are for the business and the particular aspects you want to look at when you want to change a dynamic of the culture or something else. And in particular with DevSecOps, you're looking at security issues. You're looking at gated elements that you want to transition into guardrails, whether it's aspects around code reviews, threat assessment, threat modeling, how you're operating at scale in production with patch management, all these sort of mechanisms that you want to be able to scale appropriately with your systems. But when you're building the case as well, you want to be very cognizant of the risk associated with it. You don't want to come out and present a business case to leadership where you're going to say, we want to drive cultural change, have all the benefits outlined, have the things you're going to address for innovation, but not really look at the risk, because there are risks involved, right? Especially if you're a successful organization, you're like, well, why do I need to do this? So what you want to look at is what's the risk to cultural change, because there's an impact. You're changing behavior. You're using someone else's resources. You're going to re-articulate the way the enterprise operates. So it's addressing those risks, mitigating those, documenting them, so you can actually have a cogent business case on and buy-in, because you're going to need resources, both from a dollar sense as well from actually people, in order to achieve a transition on this. And when we talk about the transition, we're looking at different aspects of looking at cultural change. And the number one thing, as I mentioned earlier, that we see is a lot of those core values are not documented. So actually documenting what you want the change to be, what you want those values to be. For Amazon in particular, we have the leadership principles. We have them codified, they're down. We use them to drive the way we actually hire and the way our teams operate. From an agile operation perspective, from the way we do DevSecOps, those leadership principles are ingrained in theirs. So documenting those, communicating them out to the organization, then incentivizing staff, reward systems are key. And then, of course, hiring. Like I said, our hiring processes are built around the leadership principles and how those are articulated, how people are evaluated. Because that's going to also, as you grow in success in your systems and services and innovation path, really moves upward. You want to be able to scale, and so you want to make sure you're doing the right hiring to align with the way you're doing team configuration, in this case, the way you're doing DevSecOps. So on the couple things to keep in mind from when you're crafting the business plan is particularly around some key tenets on organization. One, it's an actual plan. You're crafting something that needs to be documented, your strategy outlined, what you need to do. You want it to be scoped appropriately. You don't want to boil the ocean on cultural issues that aren't effective for what you're trying to accomplish. And then you want to be able to have an understanding that you're not just looking at organizational change, you're actually needing to change people. The way each individual in the organization operates, how that's going to affect long-term prospects for those persons in the organization, and then how that's going to culminate in hiring changes. And on the other side is understanding that, in general, people tend to not embrace change readily, right? And just showing that this is a viable solution or there's value here isn't enough to really be a linchpin to change. You want to actually have an investment, have an employee understand how it's going to reduce their burden, how it's going to improve the organizational makeup, and then what that's going to do to actually improve their situation. And always remember that the message conveyed is not always the message received when you're doing this. So have that feedback loop in place where you're messaging out like what the benefits of this are. Is the staff really understanding this in the way you're messaging it? If not, readjust, continue to adjust until you're there and you're having a message that's coming through to your individual staff. Yes?
How do you know you're managing change? What's the way to measure it? Is there a way to measure it?
Right. So the question was, how do you know you're managing change and measuring it? So one of the things you want to do is, in your plan, you would have milestones for what actually are the particular elements of the change you want. So in this case, when we talk about scoping it appropriately for DevSecOps, you would actually have particular metrics around the way the team is constructed, where there are small successes that are being built. So in the sense that you want to demonstrate success over and over again. So you would actually build a team to look at, all right, here's success patterns that we're going to, let's say, craft a particular pattern that's reusable across the enterprise. And having another team actually come in and want to learn that. And then you take the temperature from sort of a social view of the organization to see the interest in moving this. And then as you communicate this, as you provide opportunities for training and education, if you do communities of practice, how the folks are actually interacting in those communities, how you're actually doing the education and interacting from a learning management standpoint, all those things can be captured and looked at to see, are you getting traction and are people sort of proactively engaging in that? So the question was, can I give a concrete example on there? So one of the elements is ticketing. So driving a culture to understand the importance of appropriate ticketing for security, right? So one of the things that it comes down to from a, let's say, security awareness training is reinforcing the mechanism is if you have a question, ticket security, right? That's something that we do internally a lot, is really focusing on always ticket security. Don't be ashamed, it's fine. Take it at a high severity and we'll deal with it on the inside. And through both training, education, awareness, the way we do communities of practice, all sort of reinforce that paradigm. And then we can look at the measurements of what are we ticketing, how are we ticketing it versus things that are coming through in email and other ways, and actually sort of seeing the cultural change for that. All right, so once you have sort of the business case outlined, you have consensus on leadership, you have resources that are been allocated, is looking at sort of building that foundational team. And in this case, we're looking at commissioning a Cloud Center of Excellence as sort of the foundation team. And we're using the CCOE mechanism because the first sort of DevSecOps teams is going to be responsible for building patterns, building tools, scripts, test automation, and building it in such a way and capturing lessons learned in such a way that it'll scale out for the rest of the org, especially as you transition and gain success. You want to be able to scale all those mechanisms appropriately. But it's a key that the team is a change agent, that they're empowered, that they have sort of single-threaded executive oversight, and that they own everything in their purview because they're going to be operating in a fast fashion, and they're going to be really touching elements that previously were siloed in a lot of businesses, especially around security automation, threat modeling, things that they're going to build reusable patterns for that were previously probably not touched by this type of team. So you want to be able to have a sort of clear insight into that. And when I say on there, there's, these are two pizza teams as far as when we're just from a sizing aspect. That basically means it's a small, agile team of sort of high performers that can pivot quickly. 8 to 10 folks, does that feed, two pizzas feed that anymore? Probably not. So, but in concept, it's basically a small, agile team that we're looking at. Now, the functions of it, like I said, they're overarching concern is to build the practices, build by doing, targeting a pilot workload, pilot system, whether it's particularly could be greenfield or there's a particular system that exists that you want to transition into this sort of mode of operations. And using that to start building these practices out. And whether it's infrastructure as code, it's automation and monitoring tools you want to use, how automated response mechanisms, Lambda functions, all these other elements that they'll end up building out as part of the practice, and how that's going to actually reinforce the culture of the organization as well by demonstrating success in these smaller iterative fashion. So basically, there's not a lot of rocket science here when it comes to just staffing it out in a base concept, right? You're going to have a product manager or something akin to that really is that interface with the business that is actually driving the ownership and the requirements and the backlog. They're going to be partnered with a technical leader that actually is going to be sort of that architecture lead for the rest of the team. That goes into aspects of infrastructure engineering, which those engineers are going to be responsible for building the resources and the reusable packages for other aspects of the team. This is maybe hardened AMI or particular CloudFormation scripts for building a secure VPC. However you want to construct it, it's basically packaging those cloud resources for use by other elements. And then we have the security engineers who are going to be working with all these aspects as well as building their own test cases around security automation. But they're really going to help instantiate the rest of the team as security champions, really try to raise the bar for really configuring and managing aspects of the transition and the patterns in a secure fashion. And I'll also throw in for folks, for organizations that particularly applies to, this is also compliance elements. This is understanding how do I build to demonstrate assurance, because that's a key aspect on there, because you want to be able to not just build securely, but build securely in a way that things are being captured, logged, monitored, and you can take those artifacts and demonstrate them, whether it's for PCI or HIPAA or some other regulated element. And then we have operations engineers who are really managing that deployment to production, looking at the performance health of the system, the incident management pieces, the response scripts, all these things that they'll help craft and create, which then really all goes into the application engineering side, which are building the services that, based off of the rest of the elements the team is designing. And that's what's actually going to be out there, usually being the end user facing element. And again, just to reiterate sort of the key aspects on the CCOE, they're looking at the reusable patterns that are in the lessons learned that are really going to be packaged up and scaled out as the team and the success scales. You're going to see sort of the how this breaks out. And of vital importance is the continuous improvement part, right? The feedback loops. The one thing about this foundational team is that they're looking at where all the feedback loops need to be in the play. You know, where you're taking and you're feeding back and cutting a ticket based off of the way something's committed to the repo, or if you're doing an integration testing or all the way down to smoke testing, like where all those aspects are that you're going to monitor and then key off of and then cut the appropriate ticket or however else you want to do your sort of ITSM mechanism. And establish those patterns and that sort of normalcy that the rest of the organization is going to use as you build out more and more DevSecOps teams. And they also are going to demonstrate, in particular, the fact that the tools are there just to drive the success of the teams and improve quality, security, reduce burden. It's understanding that the tooling that you're choosing is purpose-built for the particular aspect you want to do. It's not that the tools in and of itself make DevSecOps. It's the fact that you're using the tooling in order, for example, to scale your security function, right? You're not going to, if you want to move from manual security reviews and move it into sort of test automation, then you're looking at security tooling. So as we scale, and let's say your foundational team has success, the rest of the enterprise starts adopting it, you want to look at wider resource use, it's going to actually start coming out that there's going to be DevSecOps teams focus on particular outcomes. Right now you're going to have one that's going to be particularly around building infrastructure resources for other teams to use. So their outcomes are going to be focused on it's going to be a cross-team skill set, but their outcomes are going to be focused on packaging infrastructure services, depositing those into some mechanism such as a repo or a service catalog that other teams are then going to leverage. And then you'll start scaling those teams out, and you'll see that this, from a large enterprise aspect, is generally how you start seeing that success scale. And they'll have teams that are now focused on particular outcomes for delivery. And just to give an example of from a workflow perspective of what this looks like, you can have your cloud services piece on one side. That pipeline is building those secure CloudFormation, the hardened AMIs, all those aspects that are in a workflow that get deposited to a repo or a shared services piece that are then pulled by an application services team to build on and deliver their element. But if, let's say, there's now a feature request from the application services team, that goes to the DevSecOps team handling infrastructure, and they now are looking at producing new feature capabilities or updating based off a new, let's say, release from AWS on how to, and incorporating that into their pipeline and how to deliver that to the application team. And you'll see these similar cycles you'll see with operations and security as each of these teams are builders and focusing on particular outcomes that'll be reused. And then in the end, you start seeing it scale out and scale out more, and you start looking at each team even more granularly, looking at particular outcomes around whether it's building an ecosystem around perimeter security services or response functions for incident management. And you see it start breaking out into these pipelines, which each of these teams, where they intersect either through shared service aspects or other types of repos. So now with focus a little bit more on security aspect of really driving security into the pipeline and really focusing on it as a business enabler. And to do that, we first have to look at an organizational aspect and making sure security generally has the right fit and location in the organization. One thing is vital is moving security up the food chain so they have a seat at the table with the rest of organizational leadership. Right, so because if you want to start looking at security as quality, you want to look at security if there's a defect identified, it having the same level of pausing the pipeline to production as anything else from a feature or performance standpoint. You want to make sure they have the same seat at the table. And then you also want to push security out there into the community of the organization. You want them to own educational aspects, really educating the community, establishing communities of practice around core capabilities, and really proliferating that knowledge of security operations. Because the overall aspect is you're trying to make everyone an owner in security and sort of raising the bar, whether it's from a developer on secure coding practices or an operator on understanding what to manage, what to look for from a correlation standpoint. Really raising the bar. And then finally, when ensure cloud awareness is really about security practitioners and other folks educating on the proper practices around using cloud services from a security standpoint. And again, driving that security ownership as you build out mechanisms in the pipeline. And at the heart of it all is that from a security organization standpoint, they should never say no. Like internally, we could view it as a failure if the security org has to say no. We should really be saying when we're brought with a problem is, how can we deliver this, right? What's a means of doing it? We may not be able to deliver it in the way the requester is asking, but there may be an alternative way of getting the same results. And it's really looking at security and transitioning it to a business enabler, and being really key on enabling the business overall. And part of this is removing the gating operations as much as possible and building guardrails. And overall, culturally, what that does is you start transitioning the security org into an org of builders, right? And then for example, as we previously saw, building out the CCOE as it scales out into different outcome-focused groups, you can actually have security builders building mechanisms, building test automation, building guardrails to be reused and implemented within other pipelines. And overall is reinforcing the fact that security is there to drive business success and figuring out how to do it while managing risk appropriately. So to turn everyone into security owners, one of the things, and we drive this ourselves from the security org, is education, having programs out there to really establish everybody on the same level, trying to contextualize and raise the bar on security overall, and having the programs, and having opportunities. This could be driving certifications, it could be driving internal trainings, brown bags, what have you. And then getting folks like HR into the loop and other things to incentivize employees to actually complete these trainings, to actually increase their skill set and their operational capability. And then on the other side is, and this goes back to having securities as builders, is really approving and helping instantiate the particular tooling to enable all of this, whether it's collaboration tooling or you're actually going to get other aspects of quality enhanced tooling when it comes to test automation and other pieces involved, but actually focusing on that building aspect and incorporating it into the pipeline. And then what this does is you drive it to the left and you push it into the pipeline and you're adjusting it from the culture, and you see success and consistency, which generally breeds more acceptance among the organization. You're actually going to get to a point where you have these focused iterative outcomes, and you're going to want people to readily adopt in their own programs and the other business units. So when we look at security strategy for CI/CD, it's generally around 3 areas, right? We're security of the pipeline, the construct of it, the hardening of it, in the pipeline, where it's really about a lot of the test-focused pieces, automation, static code analysis, dynamic analysis, and then enforcement of the pipeline, which is really key in the sense that only things get to, let's say, production are only delivered via a pipeline. There's no alternate means of doing that, and being able to demonstrate that is key, because that's when you start getting away from humans away from aspects of interacting with production, as well as really demonstrating a high level of assurance on the quality and security of your system. Which really reinforces the fact that as good as we are with coming up with ideas and building things, humans are inconsistent, we get tired, we have bad days, and then we cause problems. So getting humans away from the data is sort of our internal mantra, and something we've been talking about publicly for a while, and looking at ways of doing that. And that doesn't just mean access to critical or sensitive data. That means getting humans away from managing systems that directly interact or actually critical systems. Basically always looking at, is there a way for automation or sort of a logical abstraction to keep humans from actually getting too close to important systems or critical systems or data? And in the cases that humans still, you still need certain aspects or break glass in case of emergency, is then understanding where those are and really building the appropriate mechanisms to do that, right? If you have to remote into a system because it's the only possible way of fixing it, do you have the right controls around it? Do you have the right sort of bastion design? Are you securing the shell appropriately? Do you have the right data coming in? Do you have restricted operations you can perform? Do you have sort of quorum-based authentication? Do you have it tracked with ITSM, right? So in the cases where you actually can't pull everyone away from it too much, it's making sure you just have the right mechanisms and the right, again, level of assurance that you can demonstrate that you have security to mitigate these issues. Now, the other aspect that we want to look at when building a pipeline, and this is some of the stuff you'll come in later as you do the workshop elements, is addressing sort of the fears and the blind spots from the security perspective. Because a lot of these things end up turning into the guardrails and actually let security craft the policies to let you move faster by addressing these issues. And one of the main ones is disparate sources, right? So when we think of our environments, they're built up of our provider APIs, open source packages, commercial software, virtual machines, all sorts of elements that come in and feed the build of a system. And being able to manage these and capture these and appropriately monitor them are key. For example, pulling down a compiled binary from an open source repo versus actually pulling source and treating it with the same code review aspects and entry into the pipeline as you would anything built in-house. is understanding and putting those mechanisms in place. The other aspect is sort of a lack of rigor. Again, manual intervention, manual operations management, having humans do too much of the work introduces inconsistencies, right? There's, especially when you're talking about large fleets of operation, as you scale, as a especially larger enterprise have to look at, one person responsible for hundreds or thousands of boxes. It's just, there's going to be a breakdown. And so looking at sort of automation and the way to actually provide consistency and quality in the way you manage and deliver your operations. And that goes into actually the pipeline and enforcement of the pipeline and providing rigorous testing at each relevant phase and stage. And you'll take a look at that a little bit more later on in the workshops. And then scaling. And this just isn't scaling up and out for, accommodating customer demand or dealing with something like a DDoS, but this is also scaling down, reducing surface area when not needed. There's a lot of organizations where developers and other folks, sort of build up a test environment, for a little bit of analysis, taking some elements, and then sometimes they don't always remember to deconstruct it and terminate it. Sometimes it's out there, unbeknownst to maybe operations or security, and now you have your attack surface even larger than it needed to be. Enforcing those elements through pipeline automation instead of giving someone access to be able to build those manually means that it can be torn down by the pipeline versus having some life outside of there that now you have this sort of shadow IT element. And the other aspect of scaling too, which is important from a security builder piece, is making sure that you're building the functions in the pipeline that can scale with rapid deployment and continued monitoring from operations. Meaning that if you're successful, you have a system that's got a lot of end users that starts scaling, you don't want to suddenly hit a scaling limit because your security enforcement mechanisms broke because they didn't scale with it. So looking at the ability to scale security with success of the service so it doesn't become a business blocker is key. And by doing all these things, then you start freeing up security to focus on building and helping services and the rest of the DevSecOps teams enable their outcomes. And so let's take a little bit of a look on what this sort of notionally looks like from a pipeline process. And first and foremost is, from a security perspective, is looking at threat modeling at the earliest stages, right? Starting to capture what controls you're going to need in enforcement mechanisms based off of the way the system's designed, the data and the workload sensitivities you're going to be using. And then the resources that'll be entailed from the different disparate groups, right? Whether it's particular infrastructure resources in order to make this idea happen, or if it's operational mechanisms in order to be able to monitor this. Maybe this is something novel that now you need to do a request in to actually build a different monitoring capability. So, and this goes into sort of the usual lifecycle route, and you'll have actually many of these elements really spin off into their own particular life cycles. For example, on the security code review, you could actually spin that commit piece off into different pieces at its own life cycle loop that has its own feedback mechanisms that would be triggered back to the developers. Something came up with static code analysis, or early even before that, if you had, as you go to a commit, you suddenly find credentials as you do a test on that. But considering it went through fine, then moving into the automation testing portion, looking at integration testing, and then again, that could be its own life cycle loop in there. And you guys will talk about this a bit more in the labs. But all the way down to QA testing, looking at whether it's smoke testing, you're building up the whole stack, all these elements that are sort of that last piece into where it gets into, let's say, an operational CI/CD pipeline where it's going to production. But what's key here in this particular piece is the fact that at any one of these points, there's an issue, it pops back up, it's treated as a security defect, and it goes back to the development arm to treat it, to focus on it with the same level of intensity as they would if it was a feature issue that was core to the system. You want it on that same level, that same bar. So if we look at it from a slightly different perspective, looking at it sort of more in a serial fashion, we see as things move through the pipeline, as you commit, as you transition over to building code, and then you finally look at it from a deployment aspect. I mean, you could see this pipeline very similar to something from a infrastructure team that's focused on building infrastructure as code, or an operations team who may be building a Lambda function to help monitor or actually deal with configuration drift. As we go through each of these elements, every single step along this way is logged, it's monitored on, and you can actually have response mechanisms come through, right? Like, oh, we found some hard-coded credentials into something in one of the commits. We go back, kick that back, and then now those are dealt with. And having it early on actually reduces risk because it doesn't get back farther down the pipeline and reduces resource waste. But we also have now a very demonstratable quality process, and actually that can be used when it comes to especially getting into markets where there's particular PCI or other elements where you actually have a way of capturing, mitigating, and taking action on these, and you're keeping people away from actually the production delivery and manually circumventing the process. So one of the key aspects on this, just to reiterate, is sort of demonstrating assurance, right? Like, in order for the security organization a lot of times to deal with their fears, is you want to show that you have the right level of protections built into the pipeline. And earlier I mentioned you're never going to be able to hire enough security engineers. You're never going to be able to populate those into as your DevSecOps teams scale out, right? You're going to need security champions in the teams, and to freeing up like specific security engineers to do more, to do work which is more focused on particular aspects like design reviews for actually an early ideation around security in the services. So in order to free those cycles up and demonstrate those, you want to bake into these pipelines early on specific aspects, right? Like threat modeling is something you'll probably want to pull in a seasoned security engineer on early on to actually look at what needs to be done and what mechanisms in the pipeline will need to be enacted for this particular service you're building or delivery. And then having those documented and showing that those mechanisms are put into place, then you can start dealing with some of the other aspects, like separation of duties, logical isolation, elements around really keeping folks away from any circumvention of the pipeline. Because once you get in that mode and you want to be able to put in the protections and the particular permissions and programmatic policies to enforce use of the pipeline on there. And security in general is going to breathe a lot easier by knowing that we have logging on there. We can see behavior of folks in the pipeline and then correlate that with protections and enforcement of the pipeline. And all those things breed that sort of consistency and trust. And the fact that we're using an automation pipeline now means we can be a lot more rigorous with our testing. And it goes back to that sort of lack of rigor fear that can be had is now we have it done in a programmatic fashion. We have rigor built into the system. And so that will help really move into the guardrail fashion versus the gating function. And what we find is that throughout all that, the consistency breeds trust on it. You know what to expect. You know that you have through your CCOE and that foundational team, and as it's scaled out, you've established what the practice patterns are, the protection mechanisms. You've normalized what the technical elements are. And so there's a consistency there. You now can monitor because you have telemetry on the pipeline, you have a rigor built in from a test automation standpoint. You can correlate what's normal and what's not normal when it comes to behavior of both folks inside the organization as well as folks potentially outside the way they're using a system. Then you can actually enforce and maintain the ITSM piece, right? So ticketing, tracking, having those things in place so you can have clear visibility of actions taken on a system. All these things go into form a really robust change management piece where now you have really clear view both from code that's committed to on the infrastructure side as well as just a pure development side. And you actually have the way it's being dealt with in the pipeline, the test results, reports, enforcement mechanisms that can be built in an automated fashion. You have a very clear process of what is changing and what's not, and what may be drifting and what's not. So, and of course on the release management side, then because you've treated it as security as a quality function and has made it to that point, you can have a high level of confidence in the production operation of that. So the other thing that CI/CD can do now, especially with the organization at large, if you want to, as you transition to scaling it out to all of the business units and the way you're actually functionally using the DevSecOps teams, is that you can drive sort of the big cultural pieces with it. And this now you have some particular metrics on looking at ways you want to do. For example, our CISO, Steve Schmidt, talks about how we have a year-over-year goal of 80% reduction on human access. And that's a high bar to drive to, but because of the way we do automation and we build the pipelines and the way you can instantiate it and have those pieces, you can actually now have good metrics on that and be able to drive and see their accomplishment towards that same goal. And then you can actually look at it and set particular other goals that might work with your environment. But what it really allows you to do is have a very clear picture of where human interaction is, where you want to remove, where you need different controls and governance and policy changes. It can actually be a reinforcement mechanism to drive other pieces of the culture. And really to close, one of the pieces we look at is, again, reiterating that security needs to drive business value, business objectives. And to go back and look at when instantiating the business case for it, looking at how to set up that foundational team and scale it, and then where automation plays in doing this, can really now reinforce that messaging on now we're not only not inhibiting innovation from a security side, but we're providing the means and building it and mechanisms to actually help deliver that. But key to it is being able to feedback loops on every piece that you can do, ways of ticketing, ways of kicking off automation that really provide and instantiate security early on in the process. And then an easy one also is a zero known defect approach. So with all the CV lists out there and everything else, there's no reason that something should get too far down the pipeline that has a known, say, security issue. And having that rigor of instantiating on the test automation side, of making sure that those are caught early, produced in the feedback loop and taken care of, is vital. And it's sort of a easy element to target because you have those readily known in the industry. And then being able to continuously vet those capabilities throughout production, and the fact that now with the cloud, you can actually rapidly build and do like significant smoke testing on the entire stack. You have really good ways of knowing what the normal operations are as you're going through the pipeline before it ever gets to production, and being able to key off on certain aspects and test misses. It's really vital in order to actually instantiate security early on. So with that, thank you. And I think we have some time for questions if there are any. All right. Thank you, everyone.